After a horrific car accident that landed me in the hospital for emergency surgery, all I wanted was for my parents to visit me, at least a call or a message to check on me. Instead, I was met with silence. Despite the hospital contacting them multiple times to inform them of my condition, I received nothing but indifference, as if I didn't matter at all. I remember texting them every day, hoping for a response, but there was none. The feeling of abandonment grew stronger when an acquaintance came to visit and casually mentioned my brother's award ceremony. It turned out that, instead of coming to care for their daughter, they were busy preparing for my brother's event. My brother, always the golden child of the family, seemed to always get everything from love to attention, while I was left in the shadows, never good enough. When I confronted them about my feelings of hurt, they defended their actions, claiming that my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The real blow came when they later asked me to use my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I was just a tool to fix his mess. When I refused, they accused me of being selfish, not understanding how I could turn my back on my family. That was when I decided to cut ties with them completely, to live for myself. After a devastating car crash that left me with serious injuries, including internal bleeding, cracked ribs, and a damaged leg, all I wanted was for my parents to be there for me. I was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery, and as I lay there in pain, I hoped for a simple visit or even a phone call from them. But instead, I was met with nothing but silence. Despite the hospital reaching out multiple times, it took days before I heard from them. My disappointment turned to disbelief when I learned that, while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents were attending my brother's award ceremony. They had chosen his recognition over their daughter's well-being. My brother, always the golden child in the family, had never been held to the same standards as me. He was always praised, always the center of attention, while I felt invisible. When I finally confronted them, they tried to justify their actions by claiming it was a once-in-a-lifetime event for my brother. They then asked me to use my savings to bail him out of a fraud scandal. That was the final straw. I refused to help, and their reaction only proved that they valued him more than me. I finally realized that I was done seeking their approval. I cut ties with them, choosing to prioritize my own happiness and well-being for the first time in my life. After a terrible car accident that left me badly injured, all I wanted was for my parents to visit me in the hospital. I needed their support, just a simple call or visit to show they cared, but instead, they remained silent. Despite the hospital contacting them multiple times and informing them that I was in critical condition, they didn't show up. Days passed, and I received no communication from them at all. My anger reached its peak when I learned that instead of rushing to my side, my parents were attending my brother's award ceremony. While I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from surgery, my brother, the golden child of the family, was receiving all the attention and praise. My parents have always favored him, and his success was always celebrated, while my own achievements went unnoticed. I decided to confront them. I sent them a message expressing how hurt I was that they prioritized his event over my health, but their response shocked me even more. They claimed that my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity while I was still in the hospital. They justified their neglect, telling me it wasn't worth their time to visit me while my brother was out there making the family proud. Then, as if to add insult to injury, they asked me to use my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I refused. I realized I had been nothing but a backup for them all along, someone to turn to when they needed something. It was in that moment I decided I was done. I wouldn't let them manipulate me any longer. I cut ties with them, vowing to put myself first for once. After surviving a horrific car accident that left me with serious injuries, I thought the one thing I could count on was my parents' support. I was in the hospital, recovering from surgery with cracked ribs, internal bleeding, and a damaged leg. I expected a call, at the very least, a simple check-in to show they cared, but instead I waited for days, receiving nothing. The hospital had contacted them, informed them about my condition, and yet I heard nothing back. Every day I sent multiple texts, hoping for a reply, but it never came. My frustration reached a new level when I found out that instead of coming to visit me, my parents were at my brother's award ceremony. He, the perfect child, always receiving accolades and praise, was the center of their world. They had been preparing for his special day, and despite knowing I was in the hospital, they chose to focus on his event instead of supporting me in my time of need. When I finally confronted them, they defended their actions, claiming that it was a once-in-a-lifetime moment for my brother. They justified their absence, telling me it wasn't worth it to come visit me while he was out there making the family proud. But what hurt the most was when, a week later, they showed up at the hospital asking me to use my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal he had gotten himself into. I refused. For once, I wasn't going to be their backup. I made it clear that I wouldn't help him, no matter how much they begged. After all, if they couldn't even be bothered to visit me when I was fighting for my life, why should I clean up his mess now? I cut ties with them, putting myself first for the first time in my life. After a serious car accident that left me in critical condition, I lay in the hospital, recovering from emergency surgery with cracked ribs and a damaged leg. The only thing I wanted was the comfort of my parents. I thought they would rush to my side, but instead I waited for days in silence. Despite the hospital contacting them multiple times, I heard nothing from them. Each day I texted them, hoping for a response, but there was only silence. I couldn't understand how they could be so indifferent when I was in such pain. Then a family acquaintance came to visit me and casually mentioned that my brother was being recognized at an award ceremony. It shocked me to learn that while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents were attending my brother's event. My brother, the one always praised and celebrated, was more important to them than their daughter, who was barely hanging on. When I finally confronted my parents, they tried to defend themselves, saying that my brother's achievement was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Their excuses hurt even more. It became clear that they cared more about his accomplishments than about me. A week later, they arrived at the hospital, but their concern was half-hearted. They had come to ask for my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I was furious. After everything, they had the nerve to ask me for help, as if I was just a fallback option. I refused. I was done being treated like an afterthought. I cut them off completely, choosing to take control of my life for once. After a devastating car crash that left me severely injured, all I wanted was for my parents to show up and offer me the comfort I desperately needed. I was in the hospital, recovering from surgery with cracked ribs and internal bleeding, but instead of rushing to my side, I waited in silence. Despite the hospital notifying them several times, I heard nothing from them for days. Every day, I sent multiple texts, hoping for some sign of concern, but there was only radio silence. It was a crushing feeling to be lying there in pain, completely alone. Then an acquaintance came to visit and casually mentioned that my brother was being honored at an award ceremony. To my shock, while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents were attending his event. They had been busy preparing for his big day instead of offering support to their daughter, who was on the brink of death. And my brother, who has always been the golden child of the family, was the one receiving all their attention and praise. When I confronted them, they tried to justify their absence by claiming it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for my brother. I couldn't believe my ears. They were more concerned about his award than my well-being. A week later, they finally showed up at the hospital, not to check on me, but to ask for my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I refused. I realized that for my parents, I was just a backup when things went wrong. I wasn't going to be used like that anymore. I cut ties with them. finally putting myself first for once. I had enough of being ignored and treated as second best. After surviving a life-threatening car accident that left me severely injured, I thought the one thing I could count on was my parents' support. I was in the hospital fighting for my life after emergency surgery to repair cracked ribs, internal bleeding, and a broken leg. But as I lay there in pain, waiting for their comfort, I was met with nothing but silence. Despite the hospital reaching out to them multiple times, I heard nothing from them. For days, I texted them over and over, hoping for a response, but there was only emptiness. My frustration turned to disbelief when I learned that instead of coming to visit me, my parents were at my brother's award ceremony. While I was struggling in the hospital, they were celebrating his success. My brother, the golden child, always gets the attention and praise, while I've been left in the background, never truly acknowledged. Their priorities were clear. They valued his achievements over my life. When I finally confronted them, they defended their actions, claiming that it was a once-in-a-lifetime event for my brother. I was crushed, but the final straw came when they asked me to use my savings to bail him out of a major fraud scandal. They needed me now, but when I needed them the most, they chose him. I refused. I had spent my whole life being second to my brother, and I was done. I cut ties with them, choosing to put myself first for once. It was time to stop being the backup, the afterthought. For the first time, I took control of my own life. After being involved in a terrifying car accident that left me with severe injuries, including cracked ribs and internal bleeding, I was rushed into surgery. My first thoughts as I woke up in the hospital were of my parents. I assumed they would be there by my side, offering comfort and reassurance. But as I lay there recovering, waiting for their visit, I was met with nothing but silence. Despite the hospital reaching out multiple times, I received no response. Days passed and still no word from them. Every text I sent went unanswered. The pain of feeling abandoned only grew when I learned that instead of rushing to my side, my parents were attending my brother's award ceremony. My brother, the family's golden child, was the center of attention, while I, their daughter, was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. My parents, who were supposed to care for me, were too busy celebrating his success. They had chosen him over me, and that realization hurt more than my physical injuries. When I confronted them, they tried to justify their actions, claiming that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for my brother. But the real shock came when, a week later, they came to visit, not to offer me comfort, but to ask for my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I refused. For years, I had been ignored and pushed aside in favor of my brother, but now I would no longer be their backup. I cut ties with them, realizing I had spent too long seeking their approval. For the first time, I put myself first. After a brutal car accident that left me with serious injuries, I thought my parents would be there for me when I needed them most. I was in the hospital, recovering from emergency surgery for cracked ribs and internal bleeding, and all I wanted was for them to show they cared, but instead I waited in silence. Despite the hospital informing them about my condition, I received no calls or messages from them for days. Every text I sent went unanswered. I couldn't believe they were so indifferent to my suffering. Things took an even worse turn when I learned that instead of rushing to visit me, my parents were at my brother's award ceremony. While I was in pain and fighting for my life, they were celebrating my brother's achievements. He was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. While I was pushed to the background, they chose to attend his event over comforting me in my time of need. When I finally confronted them, they tried to justify their actions, claiming my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement. Their words cut me deep, but it didn't end there. A week later, they came to visit, not to check on me, but to ask for my savings to bail out my brother, who was caught in a fraud scandal at his company. I refused. I realized that for my parents, I was just the backup. For years, they had favored my brother and treated me as an afterthought. I wasn't going to be their fallback anymore. I cut ties with them, choosing to prioritize my own well-being for the first time in my life. After surviving a near-fatal car crash that left me with critical injuries, I found myself alone in the hospital, recovering from emergency surgery. My ribs were cracked, my leg was damaged, and I was in immense pain. The one thing I hoped for, above all, was my parents' presence. I thought they would rush to my side, but instead I waited in silence. The hospital had contacted them multiple times, yet I heard nothing from them for days. Every text I sent, every call I made went unanswered. Things became even more painful when I learned that instead of visiting me, my parents were at my brother's award ceremony. He was being celebrated for his success while I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life. My brother, the golden child, had always been their focus, and once again he took priority over me. I couldn't understand how they could be so indifferent to my suffering. When I finally confronted them, they defended their actions, saying my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But the final blow came when they later asked me to use my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I refused. For years, I had been nothing but the second choice, and I wasn't going to be used any longer. I made the decision to cut ties with them for good. I was tired of being their fallback option, tired of being treated as though I didn't matter. For the first time, I chose myself, choosing to live my life without constantly seeking their approval. After a devastating car accident that left me severely injured, I found myself in a hospital bed, recovering from emergency surgery. My body was broken and I was in excruciating pain. What I needed most in that moment was the comfort and support of my parents. But instead I waited in vain. The hospital had informed them about my condition, and yet I heard nothing. Days passed without any communication from them. My texts went unanswered, and I was left alone to deal with the pain and fear of recovery. The situation took a turn for the worse when I found out that while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents were attending my brother's award ceremony. He, the golden child of the family, was being celebrated while I was left in the hospital to recover. My parents' priorities were clear. They had chosen his success over their daughter's well-being. I was devastated. I confronted them, hoping they would realize how hurt I was, but their response was cold. They defended their decision, saying that my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement. But the final blow came when they asked me to use my savings to bail my brother out of a fraud scandal. I refused. I had spent my whole life being second to him, and I was done. I cut ties with them and chose to prioritize myself for the first time in my life. It was time to stop being their backup and start living for me. After a terrible car accident that left me seriously injured, I found myself in the hospital recovering from surgery. I had cracked ribs, internal bleeding, and a damaged leg. The pain was unbearable, but what hurt even more was the absence of my parents. I thought they would rush to my side, at least call or visit me, but I waited in silence. The hospital had contacted them multiple times, yet I didn't hear from them. Every text I sent, every message I left, went unanswered. I felt completely alone. Then an acquaintance came to visit and mentioned that my brother was being honored at an award ceremony. To my shock, instead of being at my bedside, my parents were celebrating his success. My brother, the golden child, was always the center of attention, and once again they chose him over me. It was clear that, despite my life hanging in the balance, his event mattered more to them. I decided to confront them. When I finally texted them about my hurt, they tried to justify their actions by claiming that my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But what truly broke me was when, a week later, they came to ask for my savings to bail him out of a fraud scandal. I refused. After everything, I realized they had always treated me as a backup, someone to call on when they needed something. I decided it was time to stop being their afterthought. I cut ties with them, and for the first time in my life, I chose to prioritize myself. after a life-threatening car accident left me in the hospital with serious injuries, including internal bleeding, cracked ribs, and a broken leg, I couldn't help but hope for one thing: my parents' support. I lay there in pain, recovering from emergency surgery, waiting for them to show they cared. But instead of rushing to my side, I waited in vain. Despite the hospital contacting them multiple times, I heard nothing from them for days. Every text I sent, every call I made went unanswered. Things took an even worse turn when I found out that while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents were at my brother's award ceremony. My brother, the golden child of the family, was always the center of attention. They were busy celebrating his success while I was in a hospital bed, in pain and struggling to recover. It was crushing to realize that they cared more about his accomplishments than their own daughter's well-being. When I confronted them, they defended their actions, claiming that his award was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement. But the final straw came when, a week later, they showed up at the hospital, not to comfort me, but to ask for my savings to bail out my brother from a fraud scandal. I refused. I had spent my entire life feeling like an afterthought, and I wasn't going to be their fallback anymore. I cut ties with them, finally choosing to live for myself, to stop seeking their approval, and to stop allowing them to use me. If you found this story touching, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on more meaningful and emotional videos. Each story is a valuable lesson, and we are eager to share even more with you. Support our channel so we can continue bringing you truly inspiring and helpful content. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest videos.